The Code of Hammurabi is one of the oldest and most infamous legal systems in human history. Created under the Babylonian king Hammurabi around 1754 BCE, it was not designed to protect fairness or equality, but to maintain strict social order and reinforce the power of the king. The code consists of nearly 300 laws, etched onto a massive stone stele, covering crimes, commerce, family, and civil obligations. The central principle of the code was lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. At first glance, this may seem like a straightforward idea of justice, but in practice, it was brutally rigid. Punishments were harsh, public, and often physical, ranging from fines and forced labor to mutilation and death. The severity of punishment depended heavily on social status. If a slave struck a free man, the penalty could be death, while if a free man harmed a slave, the punishment was minimal. This created a system where fairness was largely a myth, and inequality was legally enforced. The Code of Hammurabi also left little room for mercy, negotiation, or reform. Disobedience wasn't just illegal, it was considered an offense against the gods themselves, since Hammurabi claimed the laws were divinely inspired. This meant that justice was intertwined with religious fear. Even minor infractions, like failing to fulfill a contract, could lead to extreme punishments, such as the amputation of a hand or the loss of property. In effect, the Code of Hammurabi set a precedent for centuries to come. Law could be used not only to punish, but to instill fear, control populations, and reinforce hierarchy. While we might admire the organization and the attempt at codifying society, the human cost of these laws was immense. Babylonian justice was less about right and wrong, and more about power, obedience, and terror, a harsh reminder that legal systems can be instruments of control rather than fairness.
Ancient Athens is often celebrated as the birthplace of democracy, but its legal system reveals a much darker reality. While political power rested in the hands of male citizens, justice was chaotic, inconsistent, and often brutal. There were no professional judges, no lawyers, and no standardized procedures to guide trials. Instead, the responsibility for deciding guilt or innocence fell to massive juries, sometimes numbering 200 to over 500 citizens, chosen randomly from the population. These jurors, though ordinary citizens, were expected to interpret the law and pass judgment, often based on emotion, rhetoric, or personal bias rather than evidence. Trials could be swayed by public opinion or the persuasive speech of the accuser. The accused had to defend themselves, often with little understanding of the law, while their fate rested in the hands of strangers. This system made justice unpredictable and sometimes deadly. Punishments in Athens ranged from fines and exile to execution, depending on the severity of the crime and the mood of the jury. Even minor offenses could lead to harsh consequences if the accusers appealed to fear, anger, or social prejudice. Women, slaves, and non-citizens had almost no legal protection, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation or violence without recourse. In many ways, the Athenian legal system illustrates the dangerous side of populist justice. While it empowered citizens politically, it offered little protection to individuals and often punished unfairly or excessively. Public trials became a form of social theater, reinforcing authority and community norms through fear and spectacle. Athens may have been a cradle of democracy, but in the courts, democracy could be terrifyingly arbitrary.
Crucifixion is one of history's most infamous execution methods, and in ancient Rome, it was reserved for the lowest classes, slaves, and those deemed enemies of the state. Unlike modern executions, crucifixion was not intended to be quick or humane. Its purpose was to inflict maximum suffering, publicly humiliate the victim, and serve as a terrifying warning to anyone considering rebellion or crime. The process was gruesome. Victims were usually stripped naked and either tied or nailed to a wooden cross, stake, or tree. Contrary to popular depictions, nails were driven through the wrists and ankles rather than the palms, because the palms could not support the body's weight. Once suspended, the body endured unimaginable stress. Gravity pulled painfully on the joints, circulation slowed, and breathing became agonizingly difficult. Death could take hours or even days, often caused by a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and suffocation. Crucifixion was highly symbolic. Victims were displayed in public, along roadsides or marketplaces, where passersby could witness the ultimate price of defiance. Roman authorities carefully selected who would be crucified to maximize the psychological impact. It was a form of social control designed to instill fear across entire communities, not just punish individuals. This method illustrates the darker side of Roman law. The legal system was not only about maintaining order, but also about demonstrating the power of the state in the most extreme way possible. Justice, in this context, was brutal, ritualized, and uncompromising. Crucifixion reminds us that in Rome, law and terror were inseparable, and the suffering of the few served as a warning to the many.
During the Middle Ages, torture was not only a tool for punishment, it was a legitimate part of the legal system across much of Europe. Kings, nobles, and even the church used it to extract confessions, enforce obedience, and instill fear. Torture chambers were meticulously designed to prolong suffering, leaving no room for mercy. A wide variety of devices were employed, each more horrifying than the last. The rack stretched the body until bones dislocated. The Iron Maiden, though partially legendary, symbolized the extreme cruelty of the era, enclosing victims in spikes. Thumb screws crushed fingers, and the breaking wheel shattered bones while leaving the victim conscious for hours. Every method had the same purpose: to terrorize both the accused and the public, turning punishment into spectacle. Unlike modern justice, medieval systems did not prioritize evidence or fairness. Torture was often a prerequisite for conviction. If someone was accused of theft, heresy, or treason, authorities would rely on forced confessions, believing that the truth could only emerge through pain. The public nature of these punishments also served as a warning. Communities witnessed firsthand what happened to those who challenged authority or violated social norms. What makes these torture systems particularly chilling is the psychological aspect. Victims faced extreme pain, humiliation, and fear, while spectators were reminded of the omnipresent power of rulers and the church. Justice in medieval Europe was inseparable from terror, and law became a tool to enforce obedience through suffering rather than fairness.
The Inquisition stands out as one of history's most fearsome systems of punishment, blending law, religion, and terror into a single oppressive force. Established by the Catholic Church, its primary goal was to identify, punish, and eradicate heresy. In theory, it was meant to protect the faith, but in practice, it became a system designed to control populations and enforce conformity through fear. Accusations alone could trigger investigation, and the accused often had little chance to defend themselves. Torture was a common and sanctioned tool used to extract confessions or implicate others. Techniques included the strappado, where victims were suspended by their arms, often with weights attached to their legs, causing dislocations and immense pain. The fear of torture was as powerful as the act itself, ensuring obedience and discouraging dissent. Punishments were severe and public. Those convicted of heresy could face long imprisonment, brutal mutilation, or execution, often by burning at the stake. Families and communities were also terrorized, as attending or witnessing such punishments reinforced the Church's authority. The Inquisition was less concerned with justice and more focused on maintaining social and religious control. Over centuries, regions under the Inquisition's reach lived under a constant climate of fear. People monitored their own behavior and that of their neighbors to avoid suspicion. Even minor infractions, deviations from orthodoxy, or rumors could lead to interrogation and punishment. The Inquisition is a stark reminder that when law and religion merge unchecked, the result can be a system that punishes ruthlessly, prioritizing conformity and fear over fairness and humanity. The Qing dynasty's legal system was notoriously harsh, combining strict Confucian principles with severe corporal punishments. Justice was less about rehabilitation or fairness, and more about maintaining social hierarchy, obedience, and absolute state authority. Even minor crimes could result in brutal consequences, while major offenses often carried extreme physical punishments or death. Decapitation was common for serious crimes, while slow strangulation was reserved for certain offenses against the state. Lesser crimes could result in amputation of limbs, branding, or flogging, punishments intended to leave permanent marks on the body and reputation. The law extended beyond the individual. Families of criminals could also be punished, reinforcing social conformity and fear. Public display was a key element of Qing justice. Executions and corporal punishments were carried out in front of crowds to serve as a warning. Citizens were constantly reminded of the consequences of breaking the law, ensuring obedience through terror as much as through legal authority. The Qing system illustrates how law can function as a tool of control rather than fairness. It blended moral expectation with physical punishment, making justice a matter of state power rather than impartial judgment. In this system, survival often depended less on innocence and more on social standing, loyalty, and adherence to strict rules, showing how a legal system can be both organized and ruthlessly unforgiving at the same time. Colonial America's justice system was a harsh and public affair, designed as much to shame as to punish. Across the colonies, crimes were met with brutal, humiliating, and often deadly punishments that targeted both the body and social reputation. Stocks, pillories, and whipping posts were common fixtures in town squares, where offenders endured physical pain while being ridiculed by the community. Even minor crimes, such as theft, lying, or breaking moral codes, could result in corporal punishment. Whippings left permanent scars, and pillories exposed victims to public humiliation, sometimes for hours or even days. More serious offenses, murder, treason, or witchcraft, could result in execution, often by hanging. For enslaved people, the punishments were even more extreme and arbitrary, reflecting the deeply unequal legal system that placed whites above all others. The legal philosophy behind these punishments emphasized deterrence and social order over rehabilitation. Authorities believed that making examples of offenders would maintain control, reinforce moral codes, and instill fear in the population. Community participation was also common. Neighbors would witness and sometimes participate in punishments, reinforcing social conformity through collective enforcement. Colonial American justice, though rooted in English common law, became uniquely harsh in the New World. It illustrates a system where public spectacle, fear, and moral authority were weaponized, and where punishment was as much about teaching society a lesson as it was about delivering justice to the individual. In essence, the law was a tool for maintaining order through pain, shame, and intimidation. The Soviet gulags were among the most extreme examples of a punishment system used not just for crime, but for political control. Established under Joseph Stalin, these forced labor camps targeted political prisoners, dissidents, and anyone deemed an enemy of the state. Survival was often a matter of luck, endurance, and physical strength, rather than guilt or innocence. Conditions in the gulags were brutal. Prisoners faced grueling labor, often in freezing temperatures or sweltering heat, with minimal food, clothing, or medical care. Work could include logging, mining, or constructing massive infrastructure projects under exhausting schedules. Starvation, disease, and exposure were rampant, and mortality rates were alarmingly high. Beatings and abuse by guards were commonplace, adding to the constant atmosphere of terror. The system was designed to instill fear and suppress opposition across the Soviet Union. The psychological impact extended beyond the prisoners themselves. Families and communities lived under constant anxiety, knowing that a single misstep or accusation could result in imprisonment. Justice in the gulags was non-existent. Guilt was often assumed, and punishment was meted out without trial, appeals, or oversight. The gulags illustrate a punishment system where law, ideology, and terror merged. It was less about crime and more about obedience, control, and eliminating dissent. Millions suffered and died, showing how a state can use punishment not merely as justice, but as a weapon to dominate an entire society.